I think I have about 20 minutes to get through quite a few objectives, so I'll go relatively quickly if that's all right. But I just want to share some thoughts really, and a few kind of definitions around engagement. I think I know you've heard from Katie Moffat this morning, but you know, a lot of people are talking about engagement and about opportunities for digital engagement in particular. So I think it's a notion certainly that's close to my heart, but that's worth pondering on and sharing some ideas about. And I want to think kind of related to that about how marketing is shifting. And this is, you know, pre-pandemic, there's been a real shift, obviously, towards relationship marketing and now towards a much more relational approach to relationships with audiences, away from the more kind of transactional approach. So I think all of this is linked in with engagement and notions of engagement. So I'm going to, you know, start with some definitions, move on to thinking about digital engagement in particular, the benefits and challenges of that. And if I have time at the end, I'll just share very briefly a case study with Yorkshire Dance that I was involved in to create a responsive online platform called Respond. And then finally, just kind of throw in the inevitable COVID-19 lens of what this all means in the current climate and context. So what's the difference? I've had some really interesting conversations. I know Katie talked a bit about our COVID-19 research program that we're involved in at the moment. So we've been doing, you know, about 100 interviews with a whole range of cultural organisations and practitioners, freelancers, cultural leaders, policymakers across the UK. And we're certainly, you know, picking up on a lot of interest around engagement, digital engagement, what it means, what it doesn't mean. And I'm struck by, you know, an ongoing confusion really about, you know, organisations making claims that they're engaging with audiences, whereas actually, you know, they're streaming digital content to audiences. So I just want to throw in a bit of a challenge really about what we really mean by engagement, as opposed to what we maybe think we mean by engagement. So just to kind of hammer home that point, that engagement is much more than streaming, and it isn't the same as digital art. Now, I'm, as Adam says, an academic, so I am prone to these somewhat academic definitions that may seem purely academic, but I think they're important. I think it's really important to make that distinction in terms of our marketing activity and engagement activity. So you'll know this. I just thought it was useful to share a kind of very standard definition of marketing, which really highlights the kind of transactional approach and the idea of, you know, doing better than competitors do. Because I think that really is very, very different from the objectives of audience engagement. And I was aware really that I'd been talking about engagement as an audience researcher and someone who worked as a theatre producer for a long time, without ever really defining it. And I think we do that a lot in the cultural sector, don't we? We talk about, you know, audience development, often talking at cross purposes. We talk about co-creation, for example, or participation. And there isn't a consensus around these very slippery terms. So some of my recent work, I've really tried to deconstruct engagement, partly because people, when I was presenting, people said, but come on, give us a definition, stop being slippery. So I went back to the roots of the term, which of course goes back to the old French word engager, meaning to bind or pledge or, you know, bring together. And indeed, if you look up a very simple dictionary definition of engagement, as I have here, you'll find things like, you know, being interested or committed, some kind of emotional involvement, and again, this idea of being in gear. So there's some link here to being a kind of engine room and an engine that is working very smoothly in the right gear. And I think, you know, I think that etymology is very useful. And again, it suggests something very different from marketing. So as Susan Ashley here says, she talks about engagement as a process for generating, improving, or repairing relationships between institutions of culture and society at large. And again, in the context of COVID, I think this is a really important definition, actually. You know, the point that, as we know, at their best, cultural institutions can bind us together, can repair communities, can, enable enhanced socialization between couples, between grandparents and grandchildren, between groups of friends, etc. So I think now really is the time for cultural organisations to embrace the potential of engagement. A couple of other definitions you'll find in the academic literature. So one from Campanelli here, who says engagement can generate emotional connection and empowerment. So all of the things that we know art at its best can do. And therefore, why not go the extra mile and make sure that our wraparound activity is kind of reinforcing that emotional connection that art itself can bring about. And then finally, Sashi here, who says effective engagement establishes intimate bonds that culminate in enduring exchanges between producers and audiences that can affect loyalty and delight. So here, I guess you've got, a more business case for engagement, the marketing case, if you like, which is generating loyalty with your, most valued audience members. And I know you've heard a case study from Wigmore Hall this morning already about how that can work really effectively in terms of the bottom line, as well as the softer development of audience relationships. So digital engagement, I think, again, it's worth just pausing for thought and remember that this is nothing new, of course. I think, Nesta certainly have been interested in questions of arts organisations and digital engagement for the past 2 decades. We've all been talking about skills gaps for quite a long time. And I think if we're honest, we should acknowledge that the cultural sector has been slow to embrace digital on the whole. So here you've got Hannah Rudman here back in 2006, almost 20 years ago, saying interactive online communication is becoming increasingly common feature of cultural consumption. So there is really no choice. The cultural sector has to absolutely step up, and we've heard and seen hundreds of examples of that in the last 12 months, I'm sure. So again, we need to acknowledge, first of all, that engagement is more than marketing. It has different, if hopefully complementary objectives to marketing. We know at its best that digital engagement can really enhance audiences' experiences. But actually, there aren't many, certainly academic studies of digital engagement in the arts and culture. So here's one again, from 10 years ago by Terry O'Sullivan of an orchestra, who found that audiences really, when they were participating online, they wanted to have a socially enhanced cultural experience was the number one motivator. And the second driver was to obtain privileged information. So this idea really that digital engagement can take audiences behind the scenes, give them that additional context, information, the inspiration maybe behind artistic creation, privileged insights into creative processes, one-to-one experiences with artists, etc., etc. So I guess the question is, how many cultural organisations are using digital for these purposes, as well as to stream or elongate the exposure to art itself? And I think some of the theory here on hospitality is really interesting. So I'm interested in, thinking of online hosting in a more kind of phenomenological sense, if you like, not just literally hosting a website, but hosting audiences. And I'm really struck by this quote, back from the 80s, actually, but about what hospitality can do as a notion in cultural organisation. So this idea of, the creation of free space where strangers can enter and become friends. So being a good online host as well as a good physical host in our cultural venues. And the idea that hospitality is not about changing people, but offering them space where change can take place. So again, I think this idea of digital enabling some kind of renewal, some kind of renewed contract, if you like, with audiences that can help in the post-COVID healing process, not least. So just to move on to think about some benefits and opportunities of digital, I think for me as an audience researcher, the number one has to be this idea of collective meaning making. I'm, as an audience member, frequently frustrated really about, being a bit underwhelmed by cultural experiences, being invited in and then kicked out kind of 20-30 minutes after the end of a performance, after usually a very expensive gin and tonic or bad glass of wine. And I think cultural organisations are often missing out on these opportunities to make meaning together with their audiences. And we know from research that digital engagement can make cultural interpretation cognitively easier. It can help audiences decode, demystify, break down, share their perceptions of art. It can enable deeper interpretation. So Lynn Connor's work on audience enrichment has really highlighted the potential of engagement to enhance interpretive skills of audience members. Studies of Brooklyn Museum, for example, have shown that digital engagement can lead to, something like a 40% rise in inspiring and insightful comments. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Nina Simon's work and participatory practice and scaffolding experiences with audiences. But really, I would argue this kind of activity is a win-win, because it really just ups the game in terms of the quality of exchange that we have with audiences and promotes much more loyal engagement with audiences. So again, there's a financial case and there's an artistic or even sociological case, I would say, for digital engagement. Empathy and partnership. I'm going to share, as I said, a brief case study at the end, but we found in our study with Yorkshire Dance that a digital platform encouraged 80% of our participants to report a positive impact in terms of anticipating a live performance. So digital engagement pre-show can absolutely stoke anticipation. Thinking here about Alan Brown's work on readiness to receive, on being in the mood for art. Digital can absolutely help to do that. And our participants, talked in interviews about feeling more involved with it was a piece of dance, more connected and enjoying a sense of ownership. So this idea really of, an audience-centric organisation where audiences become creative partners and, in the true sense of co-creation. And thirdly, I don't need to labour this point now, certainly in the context of a pandemic, but the potential of digital for asynchronicity, of bringing performers and audiences together beyond the usual constraints of time. And again, for me, what this does particularly is enable elongated experience. So, researchers like Matthew Reason have talked about this for decades, but what happens before and what happens afterwards is as important often as what happens during the arts experience itself. So this idea really, if you like, of cumulative impact over a lifetime, really, of audiencing. Some of the challenges, again, you can tell me far more than I can tell you about this, I'm sure. But just an overview from the research and from some interviews that we've picked up. Research really does highlight the challenges of maintaining sustained digital engagement with both new and transient audiences. It's very hard to get audiences to stick on an online platform. People are very transient, and they move around quite quickly. It's hard to make people engage and dwell with digital content. We know that lots of audiences suffer what's called social risk and uncertainty. So there are huge barriers of, online shyness, O'Sullivan calls it. So, questions here about how we can try to remove these barriers in the same way we would to physical barriers, or to barriers to attending our physical venues, rather. How can we encourage people out of this shyness to be able to participate actively and equally online? We know, of course, that people now are suffering from digital fatigue. We're finding that core audiences, so existing cultural audiences in the UK, are desperate, really, thank goodness, for live experiences, which of course begs the question of the role of digital going forward. And I think that speaks to my earlier point of this elongated cultural experience. And then one of my ex-colleagues, IT4Arts, did a long study with dance audiences and found out that, social interaction, hosting skills, techniques of asynchronous communication are vital in order to maintain engagement on digital spaces. And they can support play, reflection, and development in a journey through the creative cycle. So, these kinds of academic studies show that when we get it right, the benefits are really quite significant. So I'm just going to finish. I've got 5 minutes left, I think, before hopefully some time for questions, with a very short case study. So this was a case study we did back in 2014-15 as part of the Nesta Digital Fund for the Arts. And the kind of condition of the funding was you had to have a university partner, a cultural partner, and a digital partner. So it was a kind of tripartite agreement, which obviously came with challenges that were really interesting in terms of timescales for publication, for example. But at its best, it did bring together, the best, I hope, of those three worlds. And what we tried to do really was transform an existing process called critical response process. I'm sure some of you will know, especially those working in dance, that was developed by Liz Lerman. So you can see Liz here at the bottom, who is a very well-known choreographer based currently in New York. And Liz had developed this CRP, critical response process, as a live way to develop artistic practice by opening up processes, getting feedback from audiences, and using it in a developmental way for choreographers and dance artists. So it was very artist focused. And I was interested in, transposing that, I guess, to make it more audience focused and to transposing it online. And I was inspired really by Liz's feedback that CRP can deepen dialogue between makers and audiences and stimulate creative endeavors and collaborative relationships. And since, the 1990s, really, when this was first developed, CRP has been used not just in dance and theatre and orchestras, but by museums and even hospitals in terms of training surgeons and nurses. So, it's quite established as a developmental tool. So how did it work? We developed this platform over about 6 months, and we tried to give it the kind of same 4-step structure that Liz's CRP process had. And as I said, digitized it and transferred it really from the primacy of the artist to an audience focus. We embedded opportunities for audiences to come into direct contact with artists and with each other, and wanted to take them on a highly structured journey of critical inquiry. And we did this really by engaging 3 groups of audiences. So, highly engaged, a lot of them were dancers themselves, infrequent attenders and new attenders to dance, to contemporary dance. And we kind of exposed them really to the development of 2 dance pieces over 3 months before the final live performance in December. And then finally, just to finish by showing you, the look and feel of this platform. So we tried on every stage or step of the journey to have little videos embedded that had, here Liz Lerman talking about the ideas behind this step of the process. Then we had an example of applying the process live. So you've got Vika Eringa here from Yorkshire Dance interviewing an artist live. And then, we tried to make the platform appealing, engaging, sticky, as kind of ergonomic as possible, with lots of help. People could navigate it quite easily. Obviously, this took a long time, lots of testing and beta testing. And ultimately, it had mixed appeal, I think it's fair to say, with our different tester groups. So we navigated audiences through the different steps. So here we've got neutral questions that audiences could ask of artists about, why they'd built in a certain move or choreography into a piece of dance, what had inspired them with costume or music or lighting or sound, etc. And finally, just to share some results. So we were delighted to see, well over half of respondents having a positive experience of this kind of platform. 67% said they managed to convey their thoughts successfully, which was great. 86 said they'd had a positive impact on their anticipation. I've shared these before, that they felt intrigued, involved, a deeper sense of connection to the work. When we talked to artists as well, they said that the platform had encouraged a more considered, deep, honest, structured, succinct, and mindful response than face-to-face exchange. And I think this is the key point, really, this idea of deep engagement with audiences that supports the work of Nina Simon and the work of, say, the Brooklyn Museum that I shared earlier. Just to share, one interview participant said she felt she'd done a lot of the hard work during the process so she could enjoy the live experience more in a more embodied way, rather than seeing it cold, and felt it would be less hard work. So I think for, often complex and challenging art forms like contemporary dance, digital engagement can absolutely help with audience development and enrichment. So just to finish, what does this mean in the context of COVID? Well, we know that digital engagement can help cultural institutions and artists to increase anticipation, to develop emotional impact, to captivate audiences, to elongate their experiences, to co-create content, but more importantly, co-create experiences and co-generate value, which presumably we're all about, whether that's financial or cultural. Increase loyalty and empathy. So we had quite a lot of evidence that audiences felt much closer to the artist. They really wanted their dances to succeed and do well, and they then followed them on tour and, the kind of afterlife of these emerging pieces of dance. But I guess a few caveats. We found that, it's really important to scaffold attractive and effective digital engagement tools to make them as interactive as possible. So our feedback was people wanted dopamine hits. They really wanted to know that artists had listened to their comments and responded to them. It's resource intensive engagement, facilitation and moderation takes time and care and thought and planning. We found there were big gaps in professional development in terms of filming skills and a focus on process, for example, that need to be addressed. And then finally, this idea of how to remove barriers to online engagement that can get in the way. So I'm going to leave it there and hopefully have a few minutes for questions.